So, if you really want to get a handle on the 2022 invasion of Ukraine, looking at recent headlines just isn't going to cut it. We have to go deeper, way back. Think of this explainer like a detective story. We're going to dig through the history, piece together the clues, and figure out how a shared past could lead to such a devastating war.
Right, and that's the big question, isn't it? The central mystery we're trying to solve. How on earth did two nations with roots so deeply intertwined end up in Europe's biggest war since World War II? Well, the answer isn't simple. It's buried in centuries of history, a long fight for identity, and a handful of really critical decisions that put them on this collision course.
Okay, so our investigation kicks off with clue number 1, this shared origin story. But as you'll see, it's a story that splits off into two completely different paths.
Now, what's absolutely fascinating here is that both nations trace their origins back to the exact same place, this medieval state called Kievan Rus. But here's the twist. After it fell, their histories just went in totally different directions. While Moscow was building this massive, centralized empire, the lands that would one day become Ukraine were being ruled by a whole string of European powers, Lithuania, Poland, you name it. And all that exposure to different ideas forged a really distinct identity, one that was just different from the system taking shape in Russia. But by the late 1700s, most of Ukraine gets pulled into the Russian Empire, and then, of course, into the Soviet Union.
And this next part is so important to understand. It wasn't an accident. Under both the Tsars and the Soviets, there were these very deliberate, very systematic campaigns to just erase a separate Ukrainian identity. I mean, they banned Ukrainian language books. The official policy was to call them Little Russians, not a real nation. This history of suppression is absolutely key to understanding why the fight for sovereignty became so deeply ingrained.
And that history of suppression, well, it takes an incredibly tragic turn. We have to talk about something called the Holodomor. This was a horrific, man-made famine that killed millions of Ukrainians. And the most important thing to get here is that this wasn't some natural disaster. Not at all.
No, it was engineered. It was a political tool. Stalin's regime went in and ruthlessly confiscated every last bit of grain from Ukrainian peasants. But you know what made it even worse? What really left a permanent scar? The Soviet government just flat out denied it ever happened. Imagine that. That act and that denial, it etched this profound mistrust of Moscow deep into the Ukrainian soul. It created this unshakable belief that being independent wasn't just a political goal, it was literally a matter of survival.
So, with all of that history as the backdrop, you can see why the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 was such a pivotal moment. I mean, everything was on the table, and it set the stage for a decision that would change the course of modern history. So, in 1991, they held a referendum on independence. And the result? It was a landslide. I mean, look at that number. Over 90% of the population voted yes to sovereignty. And just like that, Ukraine was an independent country recognized by the whole world, including Russia.
And this right here, this is mind-blowing. It shows you just how much power Ukraine had in that moment. When it became independent, it didn't just inherit land and people. It inherited the world's third largest nuclear arsenal. Think about that. A brand new country, suddenly a major nuclear power.
But then, in 1994, this agreement comes along, the Budapest Memorandum, and Ukraine makes this unbelievable historic decision. They agree to give up every single one of those nuclear weapons. They're all shipped off to Russia to be taken apart. And in exchange for giving up the ultimate deterrent, Ukraine gets what are called security assurances from Russia, the US, and the UK. Basically, a promise to respect its sovereignty and its borders.
A promise from Russia. Let that sink in. Because one of the countries that guaranteed Ukraine's safety would, years down the road, be the very one to shatter that promise.
So, after independence, Ukraine is basically caught in this giant geopolitical tug-of-war. It's constantly being pulled in two different directions, an East versus West struggle that would define the next 20 years of its existence.
You see, it really came down to two totally competing visions. On one side, you had a huge part of the Ukrainian population that was looking west. They wanted a future with democracy, maybe even joining the EU and NATO. But Russia's view, they saw Ukraine as part of their sphere of influence, a buffer zone. The idea of Ukraine joining NATO wasn't just a bad idea to them. They saw it as a direct, existential threat to their own security.
And this tension, it just exploded in 2004. They called it the Orange Revolution. There was this big election, it was clearly fraudulent, and the pro-Russian candidate won. But the people flooded the streets in massive, peaceful protests and actually got the result overturned. For Moscow, this was a massive red flag, a huge alarm bell. It was proof that the Ukrainian people could and would use democracy to push back against Russian influence and choose their own path. Fast forward about a decade, and that very same spirit, that same desire to choose its own path, leads to another round of protests. And this time, this would be the absolute breaking point in the relationship.
So what happened was, in late 2013, the pro-Russian president, Yanukovych, suddenly ditches this huge deal with the European Union, clearly under pressure from Moscow, and Kyiv just erupts in protest. When he finally flees to Russia in early 2014, the two sides see it in completely different ways. I mean, two totally separate realities. For Ukraine in the West, it's the revolution of dignity, the people's will. For Russia, it's an illegal, Western-backed coup. And that story, that narrative, became the justification for everything that was about to happen.
And Russia's reaction was swift, lightning fast. Russian forces move in and seize control of Crimea. A few weeks later, it's annexed. This was a huge deal, the first time since World War II that a European border had been changed by force. And it was a direct violation of that Budapest Memorandum we talked about. Right after that, a war fueled by Russian-backed separatists breaks out in the Donbass region. And for the next 8 years, you have this smoldering, frozen war that ends up killing over 14,000 people.
So you have this 8-year simmering conflict, and that really sets the stage for the full-scale invasion. But what were the final triggers? What was really going on inside the Kremlin that pushed them to make that final decision?
Well, if you look at it from the Kremlin's perspective, it really seems to boil down to three big interconnected fears. First, a strategic fear. The idea of NATO expanding right up to their border felt like military encirclement. Second, an ideological fear. If Ukraine could become a successful, thriving democracy, what kind of ideas might that give people inside Russia? And third, an identity fear. This deeply, deeply held belief that Ukrainians and Russians are really one people, and that the West was trying to tear them apart.
And all those fears came to a head on February 24, 2022. That's the day Russia launched its massive, full-scale invasion. The official reasons given? Demilitarization and denazification. Now, that justification was pretty much instantly rejected by Ukraine and the West as completely baseless pretext, especially since Ukraine's president was democratically elected and Jewish.
And from there, the invasion spiraled into a long, brutal war that has shocked the entire world. And it quickly became clear that the stakes here were way, way bigger than just the borders of two countries.
When you boil it all down, after all this complex history, the entire conflict really comes down to this one central and totally irreconcilable clash of ideas. On one side, you've got Ukraine's fierce insistence on its basic right as a sovereign nation to choose its own destiny, its own alliances, its own future. And on the other side, you have Russia's insistence on having a sphere of influence and its absolute refusal to let Ukraine leave its orbit. And that leaves us with one last and pretty chilling thought to consider. Remember, Ukraine gave up the world's third-largest nuclear arsenal for a promise of security, a promise that was broken by one of the very nations that made it. So the big question for all of us is this: if those kinds of security assurances can just be torn up, what on earth does that mean for global security? What does it mean for the whole idea of preventing the spread of nuclear weapons?